Hi, everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Jacqueline Reeves-Pepin, or Jackie. I am the Executive Director of the National Association of Biology Teachers, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the second annual NABT Inclusive Teaching Symposium. This year, we are proud to present 6 fantastic presentations that will help educators at all levels bring culturally relevant teaching into their classrooms. A few housekeeping items for you. The chat feature is on, so please feel free to interact with your fellow participants over in the chat. However, if you would like to ask questions, and it is an interactive session, so questions to the presenters, please send them through the Q&A so that the presenters can see them easily and address them during their allotted time. Closed captioning for this session is available. It is also being recorded, and that will be posted on NABT's YouTube channel by the end of the year. The proceedings are online, so if you haven't checked them out, please take the time to go and read the abstracts from all of our presenters. And last but not least, it is my pleasure to introduce NABT's current 4-year section chair, Jackie Washington. She will also be joining the NABT Board of Directors on January 1st. Jackie will be the MC for this event, but she has also been She's also been the main coordinator for this teaching symposium, and this is really what we've been able to present, a reflection of all of her efforts. And so on behalf of the NABT community, I would like to thank Jackie for all of her work pulling and coordinating this session. So with that, I will let her go ahead and start tonight's program.
Thank you, Jackie. So as mentioned, my name is Jackie Washington, and I am a professor of biology at Nyack College, which is in New York City. I am the current chair of the 4-year college and university section, which has coordinated the symposium. So before I go further, I would like to take a minute to respectfully acknowledge that I am on the unceded ancestral homeland of the Lenape peoples, who are the original inhabitants of southeastern New York. I recognize that I have benefited in the past, and I continue to benefit from living and working on their traditional homeland, and I affirm their sovereign rights as First Peoples. So at this time, I invite you to use a chat box to acknowledge the original inhabitants of the land from where you're joining us today. Okay, thank you. So we can see that we have participants who are joining us today from all over the country. Wow. So thank you all for sharing. I definitely appreciate that you have taken this time out of your really busy schedules to join us today. And I am sure that you will benefit from participating in this symposium. So I think we all agree that the last 2 years or so have been extremely challenging in a number of different ways. So not only have we had to deal with the coronavirus pandemic, it had a major impact in our personal lives as well as professional lives. And I'm assuming here we are all here as educators. Teaching in and of itself is a really challenging profession, but I think the pandemic has notched that up a tad. And some of the issues that came to light was that there are so many inequities that have long existed in the classroom for decades, right? And this pandemic has made many of us recognize that we need to have inclusive pedagogical practices so that we can reach all of our students. Over the same span of time, there has been an increased awareness of the social issues related to diversity, equity, inclusion, and social justice. For many of us, we had a wake-up call after learning about the horrible deaths of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and others. In light of their deaths, many institutions, organizations, businesses prepared and published statements affirming their commitment to racial justice, diversity, equity, and inclusion, including recognizing the need for change. But more than words are required to effect change, we need to take action. And so NABT has taken action in a number of ways, including creating this symposium focused on inclusive teaching. In other words, how can we reach the diverse students that we interact with almost daily in our professional lives? So I'm grateful to Erin Baumgartner, my predecessor, who was the 2020 four-year section chair, who was at the helm of the inaugural Inclusive Teaching Symposium last year. And I would also like to thank Jackie Reeves Pepin, the executive director of NABT, for all her support for these initiatives and others to improve life science education. So why are we here today? Well, the goal of this symposium is for presenters to share their work on inclusive teaching and to describe their efforts to promote culturally relevant pedagogy in life sciences education. As educators, we are challenged in the classroom to support all learners so that they have equal access to learning and that they have the foundation to be successful in their educational endeavors and beyond. So today we hope to learn from these presenters some best practices and strategies and recommendations on how to improve inclusion in life sciences education classrooms and to promote culturally relevant pedagogies. This will help all of our students to learn, especially those who are underrepresented or traditionally underserved in the field. In the words of Nelson Mandela, education is the most powerful weapon which you can use to change the world. Education is a first step for people to gain the knowledge, critical thinking, empowerment, and skills that they need to make this world a better place. So again, thank you for joining us today. We have an exciting lineup of 6 presentations with speakers who are from diverse backgrounds, ethnicities, and who represent diverse institutional types from all across the US. So in advance, I would like to thank them for accepting the invitation to speak and for sharing their work. In addition, I would like to thank the volunteer reviewers who reviewed the submitted proposals and who were involved in the speaker selection process. Each speaker will have 15 minutes for their talk, and this will be followed by a Q&A session for about 5 minutes. And please, we'd love for you to participate and to ask questions, and please do so by using the Q&A tab. On a final note, just a reminder that the session is being recorded and will be available on the NABT website as well as the YouTube channel. Without further ado, please welcome our first speaker, who is Marina Araujo, who comes to us from Southern Illinois University. And she will be giving a talk titled Investigating the Impacts of Engaging Undergraduates as Developers of Inclusive Curriculum through a Service Learning Course. Please join me in welcoming Marina, sorry.
Unmute myself. All right. Thank you so much for that introduction. So just like what Jackie said, my name is Marina Araujo, and I am really excited to be here and share out the work that stemmed from my postdoc. So I'm speaking on behalf of my colleagues, Laura Burris, Blake Riggs, Jeff Shinsky, and Kimberly Tanner back in the Bay Area. And I'm really excited to share this work on investigating the impacts of engaging our undergrads as developers of inclusive curriculum through a service learning course. So first, just like what Jackie had in the chat, I would just like to acknowledge that this research and where I currently live are both on lands that are homes of many Indigenous peoples, including from the Bay Area, the Ohlone and the coastal Miwok people. And then here in the St. Louis area, we currently exist on a region that serves the traditional homelands of the Illinois Confederacy and includes many Indigenous people there. So I would just like to take a second to honor the connection that they have to their land and give thanks for the opportunity to both work and live here and also learn and do research in this space. All right, so just a quick agenda of what we're going to be going over. So first things is I'm going to introduce you to what a scientist spotlight is in case you've never heard of them before. And then we're going to go into what the service learning course is all about. And I'm really excited to share kind of the structure of how we did this service learning course. And then we're going to go into more of the research side and talk about the impact of the scientist spotlights that we developed in the service learning course, and then some next steps in Q&A. And please, I encourage you, feel free to blow up the chat. There's going to be a couple interactive pieces, so please feel free to add questions to the chat, add questions to the Q&A. I'll probably be checking those both periodically. All right, so let's get started on introducing scientist spotlights, which is something I'm really passionate about, and maybe some of you are too. So just to start off, just get some engagement right from the beginning, right? Please type your letter in the chat. Your previous experiments with scientist spotlights is that have you ever heard of them? Have you maybe not used them, but you're starting to integrate scientists from diverse backgrounds? Have you used something similar in your teachings? Or have you actually assigned scientist spotlights as written assignments in your course? So please feel free to say, oh, sorry, there we go. How familiar are you? All right, so we're getting some C's. Looks like some people are visually presenting scientists. Some people have not heard of them before. All right, it seems like we're getting a lot of mixed bag between A and C. All right, so some of you haven't heard of them before. Some of you maybe not used them, but you've used similar things in your class, which is great. So what is a scientist spotlight? So they're just one page, they're brief curricular assignments. They're one pagers, right? They're not meant to be long, intricate assignments, but they're brief curricular assignments that highlight a non-stereotypical scientist. So moving away from this idea of scientists are only these old white men, and that you can have these more contemporary scientists, women scientists, scientists that identify as part of the LGBT community, people of color, right? So any scientist is just non-stereotypical. And so students do this one-page assignment. They kind of review both the content and the life history of that scientist. And then they're asked to reflect on that scientist. So both in the content and also on what does this mean for seeing a scientist that you maybe have never seen before? And what does that tell you about the types of people that do science? And what we know is that there's been several studies here that have shown that when these are created by instructors, I mean, we're all making our own homework assignments, right? So when these are created by instructors, they have really positive effects on students, right? So having homework assignments that highlight diverse scientists works. But our question is, okay, so we know that when we have instructor authored spotlights, we know they're effective, but what about student authored spotlights? The idea is how can we find ways to partner and engage our students in curricular reform, which is all things that we're already doing, right? So knowing that students have active voices and they have all this beautiful cultural capital that they can bring into the space, how can we engage them in order to develop these curricular assignments? And that leads us to our service learning course. So LEAD stands for Learners Engaged in Advocating for Diversity in Science. So this is a 4-unit upper division biology course. Students had to apply in order to participate. And what we did is that after students applied, we kind of went through, we screened their responses and identified students that were really interested in promoting diversity and equity and inclusion in the sciences. So we had 16 students, all of whom identified as students of color, many of which identified in the LGBT community, were first generation from kind of working class families. So we had these 16 students, they each paired up, and those student pairs partnered with faculty. So 16 students partnered with 11 faculty, and these are all biology instructors. So they're a wide range, teaching a wide range of courses, anything from non-major to intro core courses to our upper division courses. And these students met both in class with me each week, and then they also met with faculty each week to develop 4 student authored scientist spotlights to be used in their courses. So these are homework assignments that went live during the, in these faculty courses. And all of our students, our LEAD students, are shown throughout this presentation below. So you can see all their beautiful faces. All right, so that's our LEAD service learning course. And here's what a scientist spotlight looks like if you've never seen one before. And this is a snippet of what one looks like, just to be able to show it on the slide. So this is actually one that I still use even here in Illinois, and my students really love this one. So Dr. Kiesling is a photosynthesis metabolism scientist, a member of the LGBT community. So these scientist spotlights have a brief biography of the content of their research and also some biographical information. We have these 2 engaging links. So this gives students an opportunity to explore and to learn more about both the personal background and the scientific background of that scientist. And then we have some written reflections that students do. So they just reflect. These are open-ended, grade for completion, not for accuracy. Basically they ask and reflect on some questions on the content, on, what was something interesting, what was something surprising. But most importantly is just question 4, which says, what do these resources tell you about the types of people that do science? That asks students to metacognitively reflect on how this spotlight potentially may have changed their idea on the types of people that do science. And then for our student authored scientist spotlights, you have a picture and a brief biography of the student author. So here's Christian, who is also in our LEADS course. So now that you know what a scientist spotlight is, you know what this LEADS course was and how it was structured, and I'm happy to answer more questions at the end of this presentation. Now let's talk about the impact of these student-authored scientist spotlights. So this is all work that has recently been published in CBE. So I'm going to give you some snippets of that data. All right, so we came in with 4 research questions. The first focusing on the students in our LEADS course. So how did authoring those scientist spotlights affect their perceptions of scientists or their relatability to scientists? So we're just interested in, the whole experience of the service learning course. How did it affect our students? And then, so these students developed scientist spotlights that were implemented in biology instructors' courses. So we were interested in how do these student-authored scientist spotlights affect students in these courses? So the second research question focuses primarily on students in the biology courses. And this was over 1,400 students that were exposed to these scientist spotlights. And then our third research question is focusing on the demographics. So we know that a lot of times these non-stereotypical curricular interventions, that they have a lot of effects on, they have a lot of positive impacts on students, students of color, students from underrepresented minorities. So we were curious to see, do these student-authored scientist spotlights, how do they impact and how do they affect students from all different demographic backgrounds? And then finally, we have an independent survey that we use just to assess our own teaching. And part of that survey is that students reflect on to what extent they have studied scientists in their biology courses. So we were curious to see if this independent department-wide assessment, if we were going to see any differences in biology courses that had scientist spotlights compared to biology courses that didn't. All right, so really briefly, this is the experimental design. The important thing here is that there's really 3 student populations. We have students in the LEADS course, students that across the biology department that completed scientist spotlights. Here, 752 were used in the study because they completed the pre-post assessment. And then we have the students that completed our independent department-wide assessment. And for pre-post measures, we have 2 prompts that are going to come up a lot in these results. The first one is what's called the relatability prompt. Basically, students state their level of agreement of whether they know an important scientist to whom they can relate. The second one is the stereotypes prompt, where students describe the types of people that do science. So this is to elicit whether there's any stereotypical views. And then we use both qualitative and quantitative analyses to analyze this data. All right, so what happened? Well, first off, we found that students that authored these scientist spotlights had major shifts in both their relatability to scientists and their scientist stereotypes. So if you look at this graph here, in the pre-response, this gray bar is the number of students the percentage of students that agreed that they knew a scientist that they could relate to. And you can see we went from about 15% to 100%. So developing 4 scientist spotlights had major shifts in how students, and these are all students of color, how they related to scientists. We also saw similar ideas in shifting away from these negative stereotypes and shifting towards these more non-stereotypical descriptions of scientists. So our students would say things in their post-reflections such as, it isn't a stereotype. Anyone who wants to be a scientist can climb that ladder, or all types of people do science, no matter what obstacles or situations, they or their families had to face, or, people who do science are just like the rest of us, which is absolutely true. So this was great to see that in these post-reflections, students that develop scientist spotlights were saying that. Now looking at students who completed scientist spotlight. So these are students that were in biology courses, and for homework assignments, they had to complete 3 to 4 scientist spotlights. And what we saw is in their relatability prompt, how they related to scientists. We found that once again, if you look at all courses, we go from about 50% in the pre compared to almost 80% in the post. So we see once again, another major shift in how students relate to scientists. And what's interesting is that we saw that similar shift across all demographics, right? We predicted that, this would have an impact on women or underrepresented minorities, but you can see regardless of the demographics, there is shifts, like very similar shifts across all of these demographics. And then once again, we, in those post reflections, see that students are saying that, it was nice to read about scientists who are minorities because we just don't typically hear about them. We don't see them, which is true. If you've ever looked through a science textbook, you can see how diverse those representations are. All right, so then what about their scientist stereotypes? So this is, okay, well, who are the types of people that do science? Are they your prototypical old white men, or are they other people? And what we found is that students that completed the scientist spotlights shifted away from these stereotypical, ideas of scientists and had higher non-stereotype descriptions, meaning that they would say things like, anyone can do science, or all types of people can do science. We also found that they said, they mentioned a lot more non-stereotypical scientists. So in pre-reflections, a lot of students will, if we ask them to talk about scientists, they talk about Einstein, they talk about Watson and Crick. But we saw a lot more non-stereotypical scientists in those post-reflections. And of those students that named scientists, specific scientists, half of the scientists that they named were graduate students or postdoctoral scholars. So one of the spotlights that our students developed featured a graduate student or a postdoc in the Bay Area. So I thought it was really cool to see that a lot of students specifically remembered those graduate students or postdocs. And then is this result collaborated with our independent department-wide survey? And we found that yes, it was. So when we asked across the department, unprompted, we asked students, rate their level of agreement. Have you studied multiple scientists of color, multiple women scientists? We find that students that are in courses with scientist spotlights all say that they studied those types of scientists compared to courses that didn't feature scientist spotlights. So you can see these differences here across whether they studied multiple scientists of color, or women scientists. So this goes to show that students that have scientist spotlights in their classes, they do remember that they studied multiple scientists and multiple diverse scientists, which I think is really cool. So what does this mean, right? So taken together, what this means is that, partnering with students, involving them as authors of scientist spotlights and partners in reform is just a really promising approach to promoting inclusion and addressing representation in science. And I'm going to share out 3 bullet points. So I'd love for you to post out in the chat which of these was the most surprising. So was it that only 3 or 4 student-authored scientist spotlights had a significant effect, regardless of the demographics? Was it 2 that student authors themselves showed the largest increase in their relatability to scientists? Or was it 3 that students that completed scientist spotlights overall reported studying more diverse scientists? So please blow up the chat. Which was most interesting to you? What was most surprising? Number 1, number 2, or number 3? All right, seeing a few number 1s, right? 3 or 4 assignments is not much, right? I do 1 per unit, right? It's really easy to do. It's easy to implement. Look at the effects that it has. It's like Rachel says number 2, right? Having our student authors involved also was one way to kind of shift their ideas. All right, perfect. So with that, let's talk about what our next steps are. So our next steps is that we're expanding into secondary school classrooms. So we have seen that this works in undergraduate classrooms. So what's the impact of scientist spotlights going to be on high school students? So I am, doing some research on this here in Illinois, and my collaborators in San Francisco are doing it as well. Also thinking about that service learning course. So in addition to developing scientist spotlights, we're also looking at different models where we have peer learning assistants. So students will develop scientist spotlights, but they also play a role as being a near peer in classrooms. So that's another model that we're looking at and kind of studying the effects of that. And then we're also really interested in long-term outcomes, right? I mean, the literature supports that students that relate to scientists and see that it's a like me kind of situation, that they're more likely to persist. So we're interested in seeing if having scientist spotlights featured across the department, if that does show effects in our persistence and retention in students. So with that, we invite you to use our student authored scientist spotlights in your biology courses. There is a wonderful website set up that you can use here, scientistspotlights.org, that you can go to. You can search scientists based off of what type of area they're in, what kind of research they do. It's a really great user-friendly website that I encourage you all to go to. You know, like I said, 3 to 4 spotlights, you can have major impacts in your class. It's not hard to do. Grade them just for completion. You know, they're one-page assignments. My students love them because it gives them a break from just the typical kind of content that they do. And you can see the effects for yourself. And with that, we would just like to thank everyone both for listening here and then all of our funders. So we have HHMI, we have SEPA, the universities that we did this with. I want to thank my collaborators and my co-authors. And most importantly, I need to thank these students here, right? So these are all wonderful undergraduates. They're all going on to do wonderful things. Some of them are moving on to medical school. Some of them are graduate students. So they're going to be our next leaders, and I'm really excited for them. So thank you all, and I'm happy to answer any questions in the Q&A. All right, so this first one says, did they profile scientists they learned about online, or were they tasked with meeting scientists on their campus? So a little bit of both. So students had to develop 4 scientist spotlights, one of which they actually interviewed graduate students on our campus. And that was a really fun day in class. So we invited graduate students, nearby postdocs in the area, to come, and students basically did some speed dating with them to learn more about their stories. And then the idea is that we really wanted students to feature scientists that kind of highlighted the content. That was part of why that partnership between faculty and students was really important. So once they kind of knew the content that was going to be featured around the time when faculty wanted to implement these scientist spotlights, that helped them identify what scientists they wanted to feature. So they just went out and found scientists based off that content. Another question says, have you studied how student non-authors respond to spotlights made by their peers? So that's what was shown here. So all the spotlights that students did were made by their peers, and they knew that they were made by their peers because they had their picture and biography on the bottom. And I'm so sorry if I cut someone off.
Oh, well, I thank you so much, Marina, for sharing. This is really impressive work. That these spotlights have such a positive impact on students. So again, thank you so much.
Thank you.
All righty, our next speaker will be Miriam Seguro Tatum, who comes to us from the University of North Georgia. And she will be giving a talk entitled A Radical View of Teaching, the Pedagogy of Empathy and Inclusion.
Hi, all. Thank you for inviting me here. I'm so excited to be here with you all. So I want to talk, let me go back real quick, about the pedagogy of empathy and inclusion. And I want to start with a little exercise. So humor me, and I want you all to scrounge around and find a piece of paper and something to write with. So, but it has to be written. So I'm going to put a prompt up, and once the prompt is up, you have a minute to write as much as you can. And here's the catch. The catch is that you have to use your left hand to write, even if you're left-handed, and you have to write. You can't type it, okay? So I will give you a couple more seconds to find a piece of paper and something to write with. And then I'm going to put the prompt up. Okay, so, oh my, I'm giving you more time because there it is. Here's the prompt. What is the most important element of your pedagogical philosophy and why? So now you have a minute to write with your left hand. Again, that prompt is, what is the most important element of your pedagogical philosophy and why? FYI, you have 20 seconds left, so. Okay, time's up. All right, so put your pencils or pens down, and let's look at the grading criteria, okay? So out of 100 points, you get 50 points for penmanship. Why? Because if you're trying to answer a prompt, penmanship is related to clarity of expression. So we want to have good penmanship. Word count. So basically word count relates to your ability to distill complex ideas into concise language. And when you're talking about something as important as your pedagogy, of course, you can probably find, enough words to write, right? And also you have to have 20 words or more to receive credit for the word count component. So total of 100 points. I want you, normally if we were face-to-face, you would swap with someone and someone would grade your work, but I'm gonna trust that you all did the work and you will grade it accordingly. So I want you to grade it now and pop into the chat if you passed or not. So why or no, yes or no. Did you pass? Did you not pass? And while you're doing that, I will go on. Yeah, I'm starting to see the ends roll in. So what's pedagogically, someone said I epically failed. Yes. What's pedagogically wrong with the way this exercise was designed? Well, it was, before you get mad at me, it's adapted from the book Radical Hope, A Teaching Manifesto. And I highly, suggest you read this book. But anyways, there's a lot of things that are wrong, right? And I have them listed here. Here we go. The grading criteria do not align with the prompt, right? So I prompted you on your teaching philosophy and I'm grading you on handwriting. I didn't share the grading criteria ahead of time. Obviously, left-handed people are going, or ambidextrous people will have an unfair advantage over right-handed people. And I didn't give you enough time, obviously. So this was designed to fail, right? Or to put you under some constraints. But I want you to think about, can you think of any instances of components of your courses that might share some of these issues? And before you go ahead and think, oh, no, I would never do this to my students, I'll share with you an experience from my own college experience. I'm from Puerto Rico, so my first language is Spanish. So I was in Puerto Rico till I went to college, and then all of a sudden I'm in lecture classes. So all my classes except for seminar classes, but almost all my classes were lectures. And so the professor would go up there and just lecture for an hour, and I would have to just write down what they said. And you can imagine, as someone whose first language is in English, that was really hard for me. Also, 5 years ago, I was diagnosed as having attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, which I've had all along all my life, it turns out, but it was missed because I didn't have the hyperactivity component. But anyways, so I had that attention deficit as well. So as you might imagine, these lectures, I would leave the lecture not having retained anything or hardly ever taking any notes. And I would have to go back to my dorm room and teach myself. So even something as, common as lecturing to your students can really be disadvantaging some students, like it did me. So some types of diversity, there's many more than this, but just some I jotted down, right? English as a second language, dysgraphia, ADHD, dyslexia, being underprepared from high school, socioeconomic status, minoritized status. So we know that we have these students in our classrooms, right? So this is a reason for teaching inclusively. And if you felt uncomfortable, if you felt like you failed, and if you felt like it wasn't fair when I just gave you that exercise, then you're feeling like a lot of your students are feeling in the classroom if you're not teaching inclusively. So here I posit a radical view of teaching. Hopefully it's not that radical for the people who are here, but I know for a lot of people I know it would be radical, which is don't blame your students for their shortcomings. In many ways, they're a product of their educational system. And actually right now also of like emergency remote teaching and online teaching and the pandemic, their backgrounds and their neurobiology, right? So instead of focusing on being frustrated with your students, think of how you can support them so they can learn within their own personal context. So that's what expanding access is all about, right? Thinking about these things and putting them into action. So here's another activity I'm gonna suggest and encourage you to do this on your own time. I don't have time to have you all do this now, but think about later on and list the different types of diversity in one of your courses and consider invisible elements of diversity, those you can't see, right? And students who might have had several types of diversity that intersect, like I did, right? With ESL and ADHD. What do these types of diversity mean for the way students are experiencing your course? And how might you reconsider your course as a more inclusive space for all students? So I did this for one of my courses, which is cell biology. I listed the types of diversity that I came up with kind of on the fly. I'm sure there's more. What this means, for example, students who live, far away from my campus, or students who, don't have parental support for whatever reason, and need to have a full-time job as, additionally to go into college, they have less time to study. If I have students who have attention deficit, they will need, like I did, to study more, right? To go back to their dorm rooms and, study more hours. You might have less class participation from students who suffer from anxiety, or from students who are not in the majority. So I'm in a majority white institution, and I have students of color, and it's not difficult to imagine that they might feel like an outsider and they might not feel comfortable contributing to class. There's a lot of research also that shows that. So how have I reconsidered this class? How am I going to keep reconsidering this class? Well, one thing I did pre-pandemic was to flip the class so that I recorded myself giving the lectures and put those on our learning management system. The class normally meets 3 times a week, and I took into account that students don't have a limited time on their hands. So I give them one portion, right? One meeting where they don't come to class and they watch the lectures. And then in class, we do active learning stuff. So that way students can pause the video lecture, rewind it, watch it many times. I had a mom of a small child in my class one time that while she was doing dishes and stuff, she would play it on her computer so she could listen to me. I also don't do in-class participation grid anymore. I used to, because of what I talked about with anxiety and students not being comfortable contributing. I plan on using more equitable participation strategies in the future. We can talk more about that in the Q&A if people are interested. And I plan on using competency-based grading, which basically means that, and in this class, I have all the content tied to learning outcomes for the course. And so if a student doesn't do well on an exam on a question that's tied to a particular learning outcome, they can retake that question later on. I plan on doing this. Obviously, it's a lot of work. It's gonna require some time commitment, but I'm not there yet. So how else can we make our classroom more accessible? And I have to say there's many, many ways, right? And equitable, and I'm sure you'll hear about other ways, but there's limited time. So I'll give you a couple more. Giving the students the benefit of the doubt, right? So don't think that they're always out to game the system, and thinking about, okay, well, what's the worst that can happen if this one student games the system versus this student, I'm being harsh on the student who actually has issues and actually is struggling. And I've been asking myself that a lot, especially during the pandemic. And then also use teaching practices that build in flexibility, use a growth model for learning, and provide different ways for students to demonstrate learning. For example, ungrading, which I'll talk about in a little bit, competency-based grading, which I've already talked about, and universal design for learning, which I don't have time to talk about, but I have some resources at the end of the talk. So what's been my experience with ungrading? I basically started using ungrading in an upper level 3-hour elective called Advanced Cell Biology. It's a cancer biology class. It's a small class, and I've taught it in a traditional format since 2015 and started teaching it using ungrading this semester. What changes did I make? So basically, oh, and I should go back. I didn't say this. Ungrading basically is where you're not using numerical grades for students, and instead you're focused on providing feedback, and you give students the chance to revise their work and come back and learn from it. And at the end of the semester, you might have to give them a grade depending on your setup in your institution. And so anyways, basically, we have no grades until the end of the semester. I do have to give them a grade, but I do give them a lot of feedback throughout. I do have a system to keep track of their work in our learning management system. A 0 if they don't turn it in, a 1 if they turn it in, but it's not satisfactory, and a 2 if it's satisfactory. And so if it's not satisfactory, then they get a chance to revise that submission up to twice. And I give them a lot of feedback on that. So I'll put that piece, the document back on there with my feedback on how they can make it satisfactory. Another important component is that they have 3 reflections that they turn in. It's about half a page or a page. At the start of the semester, they talk about the goals they have for the class, what they want to learn and what things they want to work on. At midterm, then they tell me, okay, based on the goals that I picked, how am I doing? Am I meeting these goals? Am I reaching these goals? And then they have to give me evidence for how they're reaching them based on their 0s, 1s, and 2s and what they do in class. And then I found that this has been important is that they tell me what grade they think they would be getting if we were doing grades in class. And so then we have a Zoom meeting to discuss and to I talk to them about whether I agree or disagree with the grade they gave themselves and why, and we come to an agreement. And we're going to do the same thing at the end of the semester. So we're going to do that next week. I mostly have the same activities for the class, except I don't have a final exam because they do an oral presentation, and I left the final exam period for those students who need to revise and represent for them to do it then. So that's sort of like their final project. And then the midterm I made, instead of in class, I made it take home. And so I was able to make it a lot more challenging than normal because they are able to revise. So why or how does ungrading make the classroom more equitable? Well, because it's a very flexible practice. It's given my students different ways to show they're reaching their goals. For example, if one of their goals is to increase their analytical skills, they can do it through in-class participation, or they can turn in written work that demonstrates that they've, improved their critical thinking skills. It empowers students by letting them pursue the learning goals they're interested in. It emphasizes metacognition, which has been shown to be an important practice for student success. It also emphasizes the growth model of feedback and revision over summative assessment. And so it changes that student narrative of, I can't do this, right, to, oh, look, yeah, I can do it if I work hard enough or if I practice enough. And importantly, there's a lot of empathy in there because the instructor is now not the boss of you, it's now a facilitator and a supporter. So I think at the end of the day, it's all about what you want the end goal of your courses to be. And I know what I want. So I want students to develop a combination of content and skills. I want to have a collaborative relationship with them. I want to empower them, and I want to develop independent creative thinkers. and I want to be a facilitator. I don't want to be the expert up there on the board. And so that's why I use these different practices to make my classroom more inclusive. And so I will stop there and I will look to see if I have any questions, and then I'll put up some resources that I have for you all. And so far, I have no questions. So Jackie, do you have any questions for me, or should we just move it along?
No, I don't have any questions, but I think it's really remarkable that ungrading has such a positive impact on students, where the onus is now on the students, and they can steer their own ship.
Yeah.
And that's really neat.
Yeah, and actually just had a question pop up. And I will say, Jackie, to what you just said before I answer this question, is that I think I'm going to start a study on this, looking at motivation, because a lot of the comments I've had from my students is that they're like, oh, this is such a fun class, like way more fun than my other classes, because I'm more motivated now that I can choose my own thing to study, so that's been really awesome. And so Jamie asked, how many students do you have in your class? Do you have suggestions for large class sizes? And honestly, I think I meant to say that, but I might have glossed over it, so I apologize. It's capped at 24. We're a smaller institution. And so, and this class, moreover, normally doesn't fill up for reasons related to plan of study stuff. So normally it's like 15 students. So yes, I mean, it is, probably somewhat more work intensive rather, but some suggestions I have for larger classes and things I do for even for this class is we do a lot of group work in class. And so I have them turn in things as a group. And so that way I can cut down on the number of things I'm grading, right, this intensively. And so, thinking about student development versus individually versus group, I do walk around the classroom and I do listen in to make sure, right, who's contributing. I'm like, yeah, are you contributing or are you just coasting along? And what's happened, I've had a couple students, and honestly, it's not about coasting along. I think I have a student who's very, very painfully introverted. And so this student doesn't participate as much. And so when we had our midterm Zoom meeting, I brought this up. I said, I've seen that you're not contributing. Are you an introvert? And she said, yeah, it's really hard for me. So basically we found other ways for her to show me that she's meeting this, this outcome. And so I said, send me your annotated papers, because she actually suggested it. My paper annotations have gotten better. I think I'm understanding. So I said, send me your papers. And, turn in a couple of these group problems on your own so I can grade you on your own. But I think, doing things like group work, another thing that can be done in a large setting is peer assessment as well. And there's cool things like students can give each other badges. Like if you agree on what badges ahead of time, like you can say, oh, great critical thinking or awesome experimental design, they can give each other badges and you can just look at the badges and that makes it easier. So those are a couple things you can do.
All righty, I think we're out of time. So Miriam, thank you again for your very insightful talk. Okay, so our next speaker is Uchenna Emenaha, who comes to us from the University of Texas at San Antonio. And her talk is Culturally Responsive Positioning, breaking down what it means to be a culturally responsive science teacher.
Thank you. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. All right. Hello, my name is Dr. Uchenna Emenaha, and I'm an assistant professor at the University of Texas in San Antonio in the College of Education and Human Development. And I am excited to be speaking with you today at the second annual NABT Inclusive Symposium. I'll tell you a little bit about myself. I am a former biology teacher and a Texas native. From my time in the classroom, I had the opportunity to work with diverse student populations all across the Houston area. And I remember having a really hard time looking for work to try to connect biology with my students' life experiences. And I also noticed that my students came in the classroom and often felt like science really didn't have anything to do with them and their personal lives. This disconnect led to students' self-doubt, their ability to do well in science, also even considering science or even math as a future career. Well, the current population of students is even more racially diverse and racially and ethnically diverse than any other generation of school-age students that our country has ever seen. Which is why when we look at trends in public schools, we see huge growths in diverse student population across race, gender, ability, and culture. This diversity is definitely something to celebrate, but it also requires that we work harder to ensure that we're creating science curriculum that mirrors the growing diversity of our students. We can no longer continue to do business as usual because the traditional science curriculum, as has been stated by other presenters, is often Eurocentric and leaves out the stories of many students in our class. To this point, some might argue that science is without culture and therefore conversations of diversity, equity, and inclusion are not necessary for good science teaching. However, this position of choosing not to take a position is actually counterproductive to student success. Academic content such as science is not free of culture. In fact, the two, science and culture, are affected by and interdependent to each other. So good science instruction should realize this and use students' culture and lived experiences as a key component to building strong science lessons. Gloria Ladson-Billings, educational thought leader, coined the term culturally responsive pedagogy because she knew the importance of putting students' experience at the center of instruction. Zaretta Hammond, author of Culturally Responsive Teaching in the Brain, recently reminded us that all instruction is culturally responsive, but the question is, to whose culture is it responding to? For those who might not be familiar with CRP, it is a framework and approach to instruction that can transform how you see your students, as well as how you deliver instruction. CRP is composed of 3 tenets. I will go into detail about each tenet and their implications within science instruction. One component of CRP is using students' lived experiences to design and facilitate instruction. So this means that students' lives and what they're learning in class become one and they're connected. And this is not just limited to like their ethnic background, but culture in the context of culture responsive pedagogy involves what students see and experience in the world around them. What is meaningful to them, what's happening in society, what is a part of their immediate background and the backdrop of the schools that we teach in, as well as what's going on in their home lives. Using this to bridge the connection to science can create meaning and significance in what students are learning. Students' culture, as I said, is what they see, hear, and value, and we should be making these connections routinely in our classes. A lot of times we remember if it's like Hispanic Heritage Month or Black History Month, but when we are thinking in culture responsive ways, we're continually using what students know, what cultural capital they're coming to the class with, taking their funds of knowledge and integrating it into our curriculum, into our lessons. For example, let's take a lesson on water conservation in science. We can start in taking this lesson. It would be really powerful if we looked at Indigenous people's perspective and their relationship between the people and the land and the water as a jumping off point to talk about the water conservations or different water issues that we're talking about in our science classroom. Or maybe even in an urban school setting, we can even revisit some of the work that hip hop artist Jay-Z is doing with his water conservation project in West Africa titled Water for Life. But in order for you to understand the value of what your students are interested in, you must be curious about who they are. At the start of the term, one technique you can do to create this curiosity and connection with your students is to be intentional about coming up with a list of somewhere between 8 and 10 things that you have in common with your students, especially the ones that have different backgrounds from you. Our minds are so quick to other groups that are not typically physically like ourselves, whether they're a different race, gender, background, or sexual orientation, that it might take additional mental efforts for us to find those similarities. As you look for these similarities, try to focus on values and emotions, things that you value, emotions that you find similar with your students. This intentional mental act of creating shared values between you and your students, particularly those who don't look like you, can help to rewire some of the ideas that you might have instead of focusing on the ways that you're different from your students. This is an act of being vulnerable with yourself and connecting deeper and deeper ways with your students and others around you. In addition to incorporating students' lived experience into instruction, culturally responsive teachers believe that all students can succeed. That might sound obvious, but that might sound very obvious, but there but this is where educators can interrogate ideas of implicit bias that might contradict the ideas that they say aloud about student success. There was a study conducted recently with professors at Princeton and Tufts University, and they compared teacher bias to other American adults. And they found out, they did the tabulations, they ran to see maybe teachers were had less implicit bias than other American adults. And what they found is that the racial bias among educators mirrors that of the general public, which means teachers are not exempt from implicit bias. When I bring up the topic of implicit bias with my undergrads, I often get initial responses are, well, I don't see color, or I treat everyone the same, or I was not raised like that. But implicit biases are actually the ideas that have been imprinted in our minds that contradict the conscious ideas we have. Do you believe that all students can succeed, but doubt they can learn in an online setting? Do you believe that students can succeed, but you don't cognitively challenge students because they're labeled English language learners? Are you afraid to provide rigorous content to students because they come from homes that are lower SES? This deficit framing can be attributed to implicit bias that can and does affect student success. Deficit framing is contradictory to the belief that all students can succeed. As you start to uncover some of these biases that you have, it's important to separate the behavior from your entire identity. If you have a negative thought about someone, it doesn't mean that we should lock you up and throw away the keys. You are not one singular thought. That idea doesn't define who you are as a person or as an educator. That is a challenge that gets many of us stuck when we're learning to interrogate and look at some of these ideas that might be implicit biases that we're not aware of. It makes us feel bad, and no one likes to feel bad, so we rationalize the idea and we beat or even worse, we beat ourselves up. But the challenge is, if we observe these ideas, to acknowledge them. The first step to moving past that is to really acknowledge that, and it's not something that is relegated to one person or one group. We all have these implicit biases, and it's a very powerful practice to become aware of that, especially when engaging with diverse populations that might be different from what you're accustomed to or what you grew up around. Like I said, it's really important to separate the idea from your entire identity and approach the situation with fresh eyes, relying on evidence, on not ideas or stories or things that you've heard from your past. It will take work. Okay, it's not going to be easy. It will definitely take work to reprogram our minds. We're constantly being bombarded with racial and gender stereotypes from media, advertisements, even people that we know. We're often unaware of what we're unaware of until we are intentional about examining our thought process. Putting the focus and development on having a better mindset within our teaching practice reminds us that marginalized students are not the problem that we should be focusing to fix. Rather, we should be looking at how we can update our ideas about student success, providing appropriate scaffolding needed to support students who might be recipients of unfair social stratifications and systems of oppression. Like a previous speaker talked about, the whole process of ungrading, getting with your students, connecting with them, and diversifying how we're assessing them. The final tenet of culturally responsive teaching is the development of students' socio-political consciousness. This is when students learn that they can take what they're doing in the science classroom and use it to address social issues. For example, I conducted a study where I worked with students who were high school biology students, and they got to learn about the concept of the social construct of race. And through the backdrop of learning about this within their genetics lesson, they learned that the concept of race is not supported by modern science, and it's actually a social construct. All right, and similar studies have been done by other researchers such as Brian Donovan and with the same group, high school biology students, and the data continues to show that when students are exposed to genetic curriculum through culturally responsive and anti-racist ways, they're far less likely to assume that intelligence and by extension, success in science is something that's relegated to a certain gender or racial group. Developing students' social political consciousness supports students in taking what's happening in society and taking scientific evidence and creating solutions to solve these problems. So we're empowering students to be able to handle and take over 21st century problems. So in good consciousness, in line with best practices, it's not really optional if we want to include CRP in our curriculum, but rather how we can do so in more inclusive ways that represents the rich diversity of our classroom. So why don't all science instructors embrace culturally responsive instruction? To answer this question, it's important to explore in more detail teachers' positionality, which is the sum total of who teachers are, their experiences, and what they bring into the classroom. One thing that affects teachers' positionality towards becoming more culturally responsive from my work in interviewing teachers is not even if they are a part of marginalized communities. When I talk to teachers versus new teachers and teachers who are more experienced in the field, this does not, years of experience also does not make someone more culturally responsive than someone else. Whether someone is going to adopt more culturally responsive teaching practice has a lot to do with teacher training, going to seminars such as this. I found that when teachers are exposed to the elements of what culturally responsive teaching is and what it is not, and also given resources on how they can implement this in the classroom, then teachers' positions are more highly oriented towards being a culturally responsive teacher. Professional development empowers teachers and gives them the agency they need to feel confident to explore and try some of these new strategies in their classroom. So in other words, knowledge is power, and attending seminars like this is one of the first steps in creating a teaching philosophy that embraces culturally responsive pedagogy. To take a positionality that's oriented towards CRP teaching practices and attending professional developments is, like I said, just one of the very first steps. Next, it will require teachers to do the hard work to update old lessons that don't show diversity of thought or contributions with modern lessons that highlight hidden figures and contributions of those outside of the traditional old white man in the lab coat. Our first presenters talked about spotlight scientists, looking at scientists that students don't traditionally talk about or see. And from the evidence and from our presentation, we can see definitely this impacts students. It's very, very meaningful. Lastly, as you work towards creating more culturally responsive learning environments, it's important to realize that we all, yes, even educators, have implicit bias. And because these unconscious biases happen without us realizing it, it is important for us to practice metacognitive strategies such as reflective teaching practices, really interrogating negative thoughts that we have about our students, giving them the benefit of the doubt. And these are powerful ways that we can work within ourselves to improve our teaching practices. So culturally responsive teaching is not classroom strategies, but it's really how are we shifting our thinking and looking at our students in different ways and looking at how we're presenting our curriculum in more empowering ways to support students of all diverse backgrounds. I hope today my conversation and some of the things that I've said have challenged you to explore your position as a culturally responsive teacher and leave you with some ideas as you go back into your classroom to revisit lessons and make sure that they are mirroring the students in the class so that everyone in the class feels like that is a learning space and that all students have a seat at the proverbial science lab table. So thank you.
Thank you, Uchenna, and thanks for reminding us that sometimes we're a part of the problem as educators, right? And it's so important that we have a growth mindset in regards to our students. I think it's really neat, and this is something I might try out, is to, try to find some commonalities between, me and my students, maybe initially at the start of the semester and maybe at the end of the semester, see if there are any changes. I think that would be pretty cool.
Thank you.
All right.
I don't know if I have any questions. Let's see. I think I should stop sharing.
Yeah, I don't see any questions, and we have time maybe for one if anyone has a question they would like to post in the Q&A. Right, no questions, but again, Uchenna, I thank you for your awesome presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
All righty, so our next speakers are Sheila Vimu from Waubonsee Community College and Tarajo Holmberg from Northwestern Connecticut Community College, who will be giving a talk entitled Using Inclusive Methods in Case Studies to Address Quantitative Skills.
Great, thank you so much. And hopefully everything's being shared okay. All right, so hello and thank you so much for coming today. We're first going to introduce ourselves.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sheila Vimu, and I teach biology courses at Waubonsee Community College. We are right in the middle of the Illinois Prairie region, and we are 30 miles west of Chicago. And our college sits on the traditional homelands of the people of the Potawatomi tribe.
And I'm Tarajo TJ Holmberg, and I'm coming to you from Northwestern Connecticut, which is the ancestral home of the Wappinger Confederacy of Tribes. And I teach environmental science and biology at a small community college here. Today, what we're going to do is a couple of things. We're going to talk about how pieces of what has been talked about in the previous 3 talks can be applied to an in-class technique, and then also give a little bit of a background in terms of approach for a particular case study. So in this presentation, basically we're looking at 3 different pieces coming together. The first is JEDI work. The case study is about malaria, which can be a great starting point to talk about justice issues within biology, within medicine, some of the socio-political aspects to biology and disease. In addition, quantitative skills, which we know is really important within biology, and also how to take a case study and weave these 2 things in together. So we'll start with the idea of the BioSkills Guide. And for those that are unfamiliar, the BioSkills Guide comes out of Vision and Change for Higher Education, which is from the AAAS and a few other entities. And Clements et al. In 2020 put together the BioSkills Guide, which you see as the pinwheel over here, the overarching topics on the left-hand side. In these areas, primarily for majors, but there is a project underway to help kind of modify this for non-majors, to give biology instructors a little bit more direction in terms of overall skills to be incorporated within biology courses. On the left-hand side, you see the first of the 2 types of pieces that we're going to cover here in this talk, quantitative reasoning. So in the left-hand column, you can see the program level learning outcomes of numeracy and quantitative and computational data analysis. Specifically within this case study, students were doing the learning objectives of describing how quantitative reasoning helps biologists understand the natural world, and creating and interpreting informative graphs and other data visualizations. Now, in addition to the quantitative reason competency, another really valuable one that helps us bring in many of the JEDI principles is the science and society competency. And you can see that at program level learning outcomes, there's ethics, societal influences, and science's impact on society. And the 2 particular course level learning outcomes that were looked at in this case study are describing examples of scientists' backgrounds and biases and how they influence science and how science is enhanced through diversity, and identifying and describing how systemic factors affect how and by whom science is conducted. Now, based on both Sheila and my context, we both teach at community colleges, one larger and one smaller. But we know at community colleges in particular that we have a wide array of very diverse student populations and a lot of intersectionality within that diversity for our students. So various racial and minority groups, ethnic minority groups, marginalized gender identities and sexualities, first-generation students, various faiths, ELL, a wide variety of socioeconomic statuses, students that are going part-time versus full-time, all sorts of caregiving responsibilities, work responsibilities, disabilities, and many of our students delay their entry into college and are coming in at a greater age than traditionally college-aged. And of course, many of our students fit into multiple categories. So recognizing this, and actually Marina did a fantastic job of giving the background on this next piece, so I'm going to talk briefly about it, is the idea of scientist spotlights. And so scientist spotlights are actually a core of the case study that was done and what we talked about in just a few minutes from Sheila. But I did want to mention that in addition to the scientist spotlight initiative, which is what Sheila did, there are a number of other ways to approach a scientist spotlight. And I just wanted to mention briefly that when we're doing science and when we're teaching science, that the narrative and the stories can be so rich, and bringing in stories of past scientists, for example, that are just missing from our textbooks, right? They're just not there. But of course, so much of the science that we know is based on their work. And so just as an example, when I teach botany, it takes a lot of work sometimes to go and find who those scientists were and who they are, but going in, finding them, and weaving that into the content. So it's not necessarily standalone, that these stories are how the content is actually being told, and talking about how each of these scientists from the past, in this case, developed botanical ideas, developed biotechnology, and how these things can inform us today about how much we know, in this case, about plants. And in the case of someone really famous like George Washington Carver, making sure they're just not a footnote to history, that they're full of history. Amazing history is told. And by looking at their challenges and their successes, that students can see themselves in those scientists, as was so eloquently stated earlier. And in addition, Scientist Spotlight Initiative, what has been talked about before. In this case, students were picking scientists from the Scientist Spotlight for the case study that you're going to see. They were not writing their own, so a little different. They were finding students on the website. So we know from the Scientist Spotlight and being woven into a case study, finding those individuals that are working on malaria, for example, that it's a way to blend inclusive practices with content that promotes an inclusive environment, that's going to shift that counter-stereotypical description of scientists, enhances the relationships of scientists, promotes interests and belonging, and course grades are positively correlated. So if we look at Shinsky et al. In 2016, very similar to results to what was seen before with Marina and her work, where if this is a traditional lecture course here on the left, there is no significant difference, but there may even be a little bit less of acknowledgement of non-stereotypical scientists by a straight lecture format if they aren't being brought in, the Scientist Spotlights. The Scientist Spotlights homeworks, not only are we seeing a greater number of students recognizing a wide variety of scientists, and that probably they can also be represented in those scientists, but also it's significant. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sheila, who's going to talk more about the case study that she did, weaving these elements in and the results of her students in her microbiology course.
Thank you, TJ. So I wanted to let everyone know that this case study is adapted from a published work, and the work is done by the amazing founders of the BioQuest Consortium. And you can see the published citation provided at the end of the presentation. But there were 3 elements that we actually added to the case study, which was already published. The item that we added was the investigation 3 that you see, which is controlling malaria worldwide from the lens of Tanzania and Vietnam. The second piece was adding a Scientist Spotlights assignment, and we have perfect introductions for Scientist Spotlights assignments. One of them was instructor authored, and a couple of them were student authored, but they were just picking these scientists from the website. They didn't create their own. The third one was to analyze the global health burden graphs. So we had some quantitative data for students to just look at some of these malarial health burdens in other countries and come up with some of their own discussion points. Next slide, yes. So we utilized the ASCNU value rubrics, and many of you may be familiar with them. And one of the rubrics is the global learning rubric that you actually see on the screen right now. And we use this rubric to actually document some student learning in a microbiology class in a community college. And the goal was to sort of correlate the findings we see with the college learning outcomes that our college has, which is global awareness. What we also did was, when you look at the global learning rubric of ASCNU, there are a few closely related components, or what they call as subsets, and in the first column of the giant rubric. And what we chose to use was the last subset, which we see here, which is applying knowledge and using intercultural knowledge and competence to really understand interrelationships, which will help students to do some problem solving, because that was the goal of a sophomore microbiology class in a community college. As many of you know, these rubrics are leveled for outcomes at the completion of a baccalaureate degree ASCNU rubrics are nationally normed, we had to actually adjust the rubric for an associate level because many of our students move on to a 4-year transfer. So in order to do so, we consulted with what is called as the degree qualification profile. And this is called DQP, and this is from Lumina Foundation. And ANCNU uses that for effective transfer from a community college or an associate's degree into a 4-year. And we were lucky enough to find one from the DQP that matches perfectly with our case study. And that was identify the scientific, economic, environmental, public health challenges that span countries, cultures, and continents, and allow students to present evidence and take a position. Once we created an adapted rubric from the DQP, we set up pre and post questionnaires. And the goal of these pre and post questionnaires were to just gauge student content. That's one, because that's all we are interested in some ways, the content of the malarial life cycle and the transmission. But we also added in questions that would actually gauge global awareness of the disease in the students. In 2019, half of the world population was at risk of death from malaria. And the third piece was a metacognitive awareness of the global health burden, and if students would be able to describe using the BioSkills Guide learning objective, how the quantitative reasoning helped them understand some of the natural world problems. Apart from these pre and post questionnaire, we followed up with some student self-reflections. The goal was that we could use some of these self-reflections to probably develop a code book for qualitative analyses. So this is what we found. The same instructor, which is me teaching spring 2018 and spring 2019, N was 48, we had 48 students. And we see that when you look at the last column up there of gain or loss, you see that there is a gain in student success in the completion of the course, which is a C and a higher. But what was also interesting was we were able to see that the rates of attrition were much lower than what they were before. So we were comparing same student population, spring semester, same instructor. In this slide, what we would like to point out is there were some gains in student understanding of the components of global learning using the DQP modified rubric. And here the N is equal to 39. And the trend is actually moving towards adequate. When students started the course, they did not demonstrate global learning awareness based on the rubric. And as they progressed through the course and finished the case study, it was an interrupted case study. So it was presented every 3 weeks or 2 weeks in small chunks of time. You can see that there was a trend towards adequate. And now I'd like to pass it on back to TJ.
So some of the lessons learned with the case study in talking with Sheila about her experience and looking at case studies in general is that using those pre-study rubrics can really help to identify misrepresentations or barriers that students may have of any particular concept or any particular thing that you're looking at within the global learning realm ahead of time. And that allows for targeted instruction, both in terms of content, but also in terms of the ideas of global learning as regards to this case study. The student reflections, as has been mentioned before, helps to hone students' metacognitives and critical thinking skills. Along with that, though, it is recognized that in particular, using these kinds of studies takes a lot of instructor time with coding and with going through student responses. So in this case, only one case study like this was done in a particular semester because of the limitations of instructor time. But it is superior for helping students to reach those content goals and to help them with quantitative and JEDI work within the course versus something like multiple choice. So we hope that that helps show how JEDI work and quantitative analysis can be brought into a case study, which is a pretty common tool used in biology education, and how these things can be woven together to help students with their learning outcomes as defined by the BioSkills Guide. So do we have any questions?
Well, thank you, Sheila and TJ. Really do appreciate your work. It is challenging for us as instructors, especially to code, right? But I think you've demonstrated the benefit of all that hard work. Were you able to post the, or can you post the link to the site that you use for the case study?
You're the citation?
Yeah, there you go. Yes.
Yeah.
The link for the biotest cases. Someone else just asked the question in the chat. All right. Again, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, so our next speaker is Parker Stewart, who comes to us from the University of Central Missouri. And his talk is entitled Investigating the Impacts of a Growth Mindset Intervention on Student Performance in a Human Anatomy Course. Welcome, Parker.
Thank you for letting me be here. Don't worry about the name slip, happens all the time. Cursed with 2 first names. Okay, so thank you for being here. I'd like to start out and just say my pronouns are he and him, and it should have been on my Zoom, but it wasn't. And I'm also nursing a cold, so if you see me pop a cough drop in, that's what it's for. So I don't know if your campus is like mine, but for about the last 3 years, the buzzword on our campus has been retention and persistence. That's what they're pushing everyone here to do, is keep our students here and to make sure that they get continuing on here. And so it's been a concern nationwide, but about 40% of students who start at a 4-year college fail to earn a degree after 6 years. And we all know this, but COVID has compounded this. Internationally, enrollment's down 15 to 25%. I know my institution is hurting, and so retention is becoming vitally important for keeping our students here. And that sort of was why this study was created, was to kind of help with retention and to see if we could spur that along. Now, when we look at student success and retention of students, we see that there are both cognitive and non-cognitive factors that play a role in their success. Initially, the cognitive factors were the ones that were beginning to be teased out, and then more recently, the non-cognitive factors have been become a focus for how do we make our students successful in our classroom. So when we look at all of the non-cognitive factors that lead to persistence and success, we come to a term called academic integrity, and it's how students are going to meet the challenges of being at an institution and in your classroom and that. And so what the model that we used is called the theory of action model, and this focuses on the non-cognitive areas, or the non-cognitive factors, and it splits those. That model splits those non-cognitive factors into academic mindsets. So that are things like grit. So how do students, when they're met with a challenge, how do they meet that challenge and how do they cope with that? A hopeful mindset, or hope, and that would be how students would find multiple pathways to success in your classroom. Passion and purpose. So why are they in the major that they're at, that they're going to be, like, why are they here? And after they're done, what are they going to do with it? Another aspect would be academic behaviors. So that would be things like, do they come to class? When they're in class, do they actually participate, or do they just kind of sit on their cell phones? Do they complete their homework on time? And then learning strategies, so study skills, what they do to meet the challenges of your class, how they manage their time. Do they seek any help outside of class? Do they come to your office hours? Do they take advantage of tutoring centers on campus? Or do they go to, like, this class has a supplemental instruction, and so do they go to that? So how do they, once they know that they need help, how do they actually take advantage of that? And so, since this is a very diverse model with multiple factors and it's hard to tease out, the study chose to focus on academic mindsets. So we're going to tease out the academic mindset component. And for the mindset component, we specifically utilized a notion called growth mindset, and it's DeWick's work. And initially, her work classified mindsets into kind of a dichotomous category. So is it a fixed mindset, or is it a growth mindset? So if a student exhibits a fixed mindset, that would mean that the intelligence that they have, it's something that can't be changed. Like what you're born with, that's what you got. Versus a growth mindset where intelligence is malleable, so they can do things to change that. A common analogy that's used in this work is that the brain is like a muscle. And so the more you work out your brain, the more you challenge yourself, then your intelligence will grow. Now, since that initial dichotomy, they have revised that more into a spectrum, because people can exhibit aspects of a fixed mindset or aspects of a growth mindset. So they could be a majority fixed with a little bit of growth, or 50-50. They could be majority growth with fixed ideas. And so students and people can just hold multiple aspects of that spectrum. And research suggests that students who hold a growth mindset, they're going to succeed more often when presented with challenging courses. And the majority of the work that's been done with growth mindset, it centers on the K-12 classroom. Sick and colleagues did a meta-analysis of intervention studies on academic outcomes, and it showed varying effects. So 12% showed a positive effect. So the interventions caused mindsets to increase. 86% showed no effect, and 2% had a negative effect. And when we look at post-secondary levels, we see these similar levels of success where we have some positive, some negative, some no effect. One study that was just done looking at freshman STEM students, they saw a correlation with increased mindset in the first 2 semesters of GPA in freshmen, after they participated in an entire course dedicated to introducing them to growth mindsets. Now, how does, when students meet a challenging course, how does that feed into growth mindset? Well, for our context, human anatomy and physiology is a very challenging course. Some of the research that's been done in the human anatomy classroom kind of reflects what Miriam said earlier, that the faculty think that it's challenging because of all the student factors. It has nothing to do with what they are presenting. So the students don't study enough. They just don't come in for help. And then when they look at the students' perspective, it's all the faculty's fault. The faculty is presented in a way that I don't understand it. And so we have this friction between the two that it's hard to really tease out. The fail rate of anatomy and physiology is about 50%. When I started here, the fail rate of our human anatomy course was 55%, so roughly the same. And there's a lot of things that go into why it's challenging. It's very content heavy. It's also, you get a lot of different majors. So you get nursing students or pre-nursing students, exercise science students, you get the pre-meds and the biology programs, we get dietetics. So there's a lot of different majors that feed into this course. And when we look at the literature base, it lacks studies where they're utilizing growth mindset interventions in the context of anatomy and physiology. And so that's where this study is going to kind of begin to fill that gap within that literature base. So what this study is going to look at, we looked at 2 research questions. So being involved in these growth mindset interventions, does it cause a difference in their performance? And then also, does it cause a difference, or how does it affect students' academic success? And for this study, academic success is earning a C or better in human anatomy, because that's what they need for that course to count for their major. They need at least a C to graduate. So what did we do? So the context, it's a 1 semester human anatomy course. I teach it. So the same instructor teaches it. The data presented here, it was collected in the spring and fall of 2019. So the course will have, all the same course material between the semesters, all the same assessments. And our anatomy course is kind of unique because we do a 1 50-minute lecture on Monday mornings, 8 o'clock, which students love. And then during the week, they have 2 110-minute lab sections. So the majority of the time, the students are going to be set in the lab setting. And then the lecture is more suited to kind of supplement the lab. And we looked at different assessments. So the assessments that we're looking at, there's 4 lab practical exams. These are the station by station rotation with short answers, no key. The students have to spell things correctly. Each of those are worth 100 points. They have a cumulative lecture final. That's 100 multiple choice questions worth 125 points. And then every week at the very beginning of class, right at 8 o'clock, we have a lecture quiz. And so there's 13 lecture quizzes over the course for a total of 195 points. So the 7 lab sections that we collected data from, they were randomly assigned. So there were 3 controls and 3 intervention groups, or excuse me, 4 intervention groups. A total of 112 participants. 64 came from the control and 48 came from the intervention. The differences in this, there's lots of things that went into this semester, or these 2 semesters. So the voluntary nature of the study and the no incentives were a big one. Anecdotally, I heard a lot of students saying, well, participating in this study doesn't get me into the nursing program, doesn't give me any points or anything like that, or I don't get any points towards my grade, so why am I going to participate? Which is very frustrating, but that's the nature of studying. And not completing all the assessments or interventions, so people who withdrew from the course, they were taken out of the data set as well. So to give you just a general idea, it's a very female heavy class because we have a very large pre-nursing program here. And it's mostly non-underrepresented minorities, pretty equal in Pell eligibility, and not a lot of first generation students. So it reflects the university as a whole. So for the mindset, we used an adapted Dweck mindset instrument, or the DMI. It has a high reliability, and it consists of 20 Likert scale questions that places the student's mindset in 4 categories. So if they score 0 to 20, they have a really strong fixed mindset. 20 to 21, fixed with growth ideas. 34 to 44, growth with some fixed, and then 45 to 60, that would be a very strong growth mindset. This is just a sampling of what the instrument would look like. So the student would read the prompt. They would then put a X or a check mark in whatever they agree, disagree. And then each of those responses would equal out to a 0 to 3. And so the students would self-score it. They tabulate all of the different scores they have, and that will give them their overall score for their mindset. So we did, over the course of the semester, we did 5 interventions. So the first one was, we got some pretest data. We introduced them to what growth mindset was with YouTube videos. We assigned a very short reading to introduce them as well. And then we did a short lecture. So intervention 2 started out with a very short lecture that introduced them more formally to the concepts of growth, hope, grit, hope, growth mindset. They also filled out some short answer course goals in an I will statement, and they identified what we call accountability partners. Accountability partners are people who are enrolled in the class that they would, when they meet something challenging or they get frustrated with the class or they don't understand something, they're the people that they would work with. The way that our course is set up, I randomly assign the sections to 8 groups of 5. And so I just assigned the lab group as the accountability partners because that would usually, I guess, that would mean that friends were not sitting with one another. And so they had to interact with people that came from different backgrounds. They didn't know coming into it. The third intervention was reflecting on those goals. And then later in the semester, we then reflected as an entire class with how they're meeting those goals. And then the last day of lab, we would then get post-test data and they would fill out 6 short answer semester reflections to kind of see how they did that. So to give you an idea of how time intensive or not time intensive this is, down at the bottom, you can see kind of the approximate duration of the interventions. So the longest intervention is that PowerPoint intro and intervention 2 at 25 minutes. And then most of the other ones are very small time commitments. And then this first reflection of their I will statements, which I'll show you an example of these in a second, it follows that first big high stakes assessment. So this is the first time that a lot of students are taking a practical exam. They really don't know how to prepare for it. And a lot of them, this is where they meet that first challenging aspect of this class. And so it's a really good time because it gets them really thinking about mindsets and reflecting on things. And we scheduled the interventions basically to correspond with the practical exams, those high stake assessments. It worked out pretty nicely just to schedule it like that. Here's the course goals and the I will statements that the students fill out and keep for the semester. I make copies of them just in case they lose them. But I always tell them that it's one thing to say, I'm going to earn an A in this class, because that's what everyone wants to earn in this class. But it's a whole nother thing to write it down, figure out ways and pathways to get to that goal. And then later in the semester, reflect on those goals and to see if they're meeting those goals. And if they're not, how do we get them to places where they can meet them? Because not all of them are going to earn A's. It's just not going to happen. And so lots of times the high achieving students, this is a class where they're the first time that they actually hit that, oh my gosh, I got a D on the first practical. What do I do? This is the worst grade I've ever got. I failed. So it's a really good point to get them hitting that challenging area and developing that growth mindset and the grit and the hope to get them to their goals. So we wanted to make sure that the 5 interventions that we were doing actually made a difference in their mindset. And so in the experimental group that that did complete those 5 interventions, we saw an average increase of 2.19 points, which is an increase about 3.65%. And so that was statistically significant with paired t-tests. And so it's one thing to see the numbers, but what we did was we plotted it where you have the scales here corresponding to the shaded areas that are the difference. So up here, this would be the strong mindset, growth mindset with some fixed mindset with some growth, and then strong fixed mindset. And we have the controls, which didn't change, which I was astonished. There was like no movement in that. And then the post-test data for the experimental groups, you can see that we pushed some of those students up into that strong fixed mindset category. Now, they did start fairly high in the growth mindset. There's a couple things that may have attributed to that. growth mindset's getting a little more common in high schools around Missouri, just talking about it. And our institution does a one-off freshman orientation where they introduce them to this concept. So they've heard of it, but in my opinion, a one-off is not going to really set that in stone with them. And so when we look at student performance, we looked at those high stake assessments with independent t-tests. And for the practical exams, we didn't see any significance for that, but we did see significance down for the cumulative lecture final and the lecture quizzes as a whole, with a small effect size, but it was still significant. And when we looked at academic success, chi-squared showed that there was no significant difference between the groups for academic success, which that's okay. But when we looked at the sample as a whole, only 13 participants in the entire study failed to succeed. So only 13 students didn't earn C's. And so only 4 in the intervention and 9 in the control, which I'll talk a little more about that in a second. So what we saw, what the study kind of shows is we see those varying levels that's supported in the literature. So we see some success and we see some shortcomings. So the 5 interventions, it did improve their mindsets, which is reflected in a study that used the exact same DMI that we did. And this was the study that used the entire semester to introduce this concept. So 15, 16 weeks, and they saw a 15% increase. We used a total, if we did a maximum of, what the allotted time we thought would take, 70 minutes, and we saw a 3.65% increase in their mindset. So very little time investment as far as a 16-week course goes, and we still see increases in their mindset, which is great. We didn't see those performances like we would see on each individual practical. This could be maybe students at varying times during the semester would hit those really challenging areas. Maybe they do really well on the first 2 practicals, and they don't hit that challenging until the 3rd or the 4th. But what I thought was interesting is that on the cumulative lecture final, we saw that significant difference, and that corresponds with the completion of all 5 interventions. So we revisit this over the course of the semester, and then we see significant differences on that high stakes lecture, that lecture final. But the shortcomings, we didn't see academic success differences between the 2 groups. So there's multiple non-cognitive variables that are going to play into success. And so it's not just the mindsets. And it's, we attempted to isolate one, but they're all intertwined. And so this is one attempt to just kind of tease out the mindset aspect and of those 3. So what are we going to do moving forward? Due to the small sample size, because students didn't want to volunteer without having compensation, we couldn't tease out those interactions between the different demographic characteristics of the participants. I had this study running with 100 more students during the spring of 2020, and then COVID hit, and IRB shut down that study. And then we finally, this semester, got the class back to pretty much 90%, 95% normal. So we're collecting data this semester and hopefully next semester to make that more robust sample to see if we can tease out any demographics. So do the interventions help first generation students better, underrepresented minorities, Pell Grant, first time, full-time freshmen. So I would have loved to have that extra sample that COVID ruined, because I could probably present that data here, because that would be great to see that. And then we're also looking at to maybe investigate if those interventions, so if those 5 interventions influence like self-efficacy or sense of belonging in the classroom, because they have to work in that collaborative environment to do those interventions. So hopefully we will see that people start feeling like they belong to the class, that they're not studying in isolation, that they can actually do science, and they have that increased self-efficacy of completing the course. So hopefully I'll be able to present that in the future, but I just don't have that right now. And then I'm ready for questions, but I will paste this into the chat too. I am more than happy to share a Google Drive that has all these interventions if you want to try these in your classroom. And the folders will have directions on how to implement it. It'll have the PowerPoint for that second intervention that you can modify. I make it very personal and tell things probably some people wouldn't about themselves to their students, but it makes that connection with the class, and they know that this isn't just you going through the motions. But feel free to implement these, and hopefully you'll see some success in your classroom as well. And I'll stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Parker. I have 2 questions for you.
Sure.
So the first question is, so you had some challenges with student participation, right?
Yep.
So the question is, why not? Why did you decide not to give some points to kind of bribe them to participate?
So that's what we're currently doing now, is we're bribing the students. We piloted this and had very good response with 4 lab sections, and then the group this group just didn't want to do it. So it was also in the IRB, so we couldn't give any. The IRB just wouldn't let us give any kind of compensation.
I see.
New IRB, new compensation.
Okay, awesome. And the second question is, so you have a number of students, I sometimes call them high-strung students. They're only interested in their grades, right? Mm-hmm. So do you think that they're placing more emphasis on the high-stakes assessments, which means studying more, and that's why you're seeing the difference?
Yeah, I think, I can't remember the study, but basically the study showed that when it comes to high stake assessments, students are going to study a lot more than just the quizzes, which I think that's a part, but we didn't collect any data on that to really see if that was true. But anecdotally, I think that's probably, but when you look at the cumulative lecture final, that's a really high stake, whenever students hear the word cumulative, they freak out. And so seeing that the interventions, once they're completed, they then did a lot better, or significantly better than the students who didn't. I thought that was a pretty neat aspect of this.
Right. Well, thank you so much. We're out of time, but yeah, we definitely do appreciate your work there. Again, showing us how important having a growth mindset is for students. Yeah. All right, so our final speaker is Brian Dewsbury, who comes to us from Florida International University. And he will be giving a talk on the measurement of equity in the classroom, approaches and considerations.
Thanks, Jackie. Give me 1 second here. All right, so glad to be on the tail end of this fabulous crew, and really learned a lot today. Enjoyed everything that I've heard so far. I'll try to be brief. I know it's after 6, and I want to just talk a little bit with you about some conversations I've been having with faculty and different institutions over the last few months about how we think about equity, and not just how we think about it, but how we measure it. A couple of points I want to lead off with here, right? That sort of frames this. Number one, we have to understand that the very conventional ways in which we have structured higher education predicates everything around content expertise and intellectual development, right? I want to be very clear to you. Please do not go and tell your friends that Brian came on NABT Live Friday evening at 6 p.m. and said, get rid of content. No, 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 I'm not saying that. I love it. I love the content. I love being a lifelong learner, right? But you even think about some of these studies that we tend to cite around affect and equity and inclusion. The measurement of the effect of that, a lot of times is still, they did better in classes. It's almost as if to say that the real value of being in college is only around our cognitive development. And so I would like to perhaps push us a little further along this inclusive practices journey to say that the purpose of education, so education comes from the Latin word educare, which means to enlighten, right? Which is beyond just knowing stuff. It's about your social and civic development. So if this is something that we truly care about, we have to be just as sophisticated in measuring that as we are with any other aspect of our institution. I was really, I really enjoyed the work of this scholar. I think he's at Indiana University, and there's a lot of papers that have come out after this. A concept in psychology called emerging adulthood, I'm sorry. And what it is, in summary, is the fact that in mostly Western societies, so, you know, you think the US college context, which we qualify for in terms of West, things like childbearing and marriage are now postponed to later years, like in the 30s, early to late 30s. So just to give us an example, like I'm the last of 3 children, and my mom had me when she was 30, right? So as I was growing up, I grew up with grandparents and you know, people, my grandparents were relatively young, and only died really a few years ago. Whereas, you know, I'm 42, I have 2 children, and my parents are already, well, my dad at least is in his late 70s, right? So they call us a sandwich generation for that reason, because somebody end up in this sort of older parent situation while still raising young kids. But in terms of emerging adulthood, what has developed is that, you know, at 18 to say mid to late 20s, as the title suggests, they're no longer adolescents, but they're actually not quite adults yet. And so there's this phase now of what the author calls exploration, where there's a lot of self-interrogation, trying to find out who you are, you know, exploring your identity, trying new things. And there's some interesting data that backs this up. So I think 40 or 50% of people who come out as LGBT do so in their first year of college, right? And there's a number of things about exploring romance and you know what they think about employment. So I'm bringing this up. I wanted to be very detailed about it, and I do encourage you to look up and read this paper. That to the extent that most of us, or many of us, have traditionally aged students in our classrooms, we have the privilege of teaching people who are in that process of exploration. So when critical theorists tell you, talk to us about, education is a process of knowing oneself and interrogating knowledge and exploring your place in civic society, understand that request is in the context of themselves, the students themselves, going through some sort of social development. This means that, how you think about and how you imagine your classroom is very different to, I'm a bio teacher, I'm here to tell you about DNA and natural selection. Like it's more than that. So when people like myself and Jackie and Miriam, talk to you about teaching us about something more, right? That process of growth that can happen even in a science classroom, right? It's not just speaking to kind of liberatory pedagogy, it's speaking to the fact that this interrogation is actually happening whether you are helping it along or not. So understanding the sort of tenets and constructs around that is really, really important. the second point of framing is this notion of liberation through education, right? And I'm sure many in this audience have seen this slide, this diagram, this picture in many different forms. And maybe I want you to focus a little bit on the picture most to the right, because you see what is happening in that picture is that those three individuals have no barriers, no considerations, nothing else on their mind, but the experience that is in front of them. You know, Diane Ravitch has a book called The Death and Life of the American School System. And I think she even starts the book with this line, that what you want is a student to show up to your classroom, well-fed, feels like they belong to that space, and able to fully devote all of their emotional and mental resources to the learning experience. It sounds like a really simple statement, but if you really kind of reflect on it, you'll realize how many of your students don't check all those boxes. So the presence of defenses, right? Let me put it this way. The job we have is to understand what constitutes the nature of defenses for a particular classroom or a particular institution, right? When I feel like I belong, when I feel like these are my friends, my community, my colleagues, my comrades, right? And when I have the freedom to just think about what it means to explore this beautiful world, right? That is when students can really, really thrive. And you know, I can't remember the person who came up with this quote, but you know, it in essence says that we assess what we value, right? That's why when people go out for tenure, they only look at your publications. Why? Because we assess what we value. So what I'm asking you today on this Friday evening is to make these two things much more explicit in your teaching. You know, many times, you know, you see this in academia all the time. We do this interesting thing where when it comes to equity, just doing stuff apparently is an assessment in and of itself, right? So you ask people like, how are you building sense of, you know, how do you know students have a sense of belonging on your campus? Oh, well, we have these learning communities. All right, well, you have them. That doesn't mean that they feel a sense of, do you ask them? Do you interview? Do you run surveys? Right? So, but I bet you, if you had to, you know, spend 10 million into a research building, you will expect publications and grants and all that stuff out of that. So we somehow, when it comes to equity, we have a different mindset. You know, once we do it, it's fine type of thing. And I'm saying no. Yes, I want my students to walk out of class being, you know, knowing and loving and appreciating biology and being technically proficient in that space. But I also want to make sure that they felt like they were a part of a really supportive community. And I want that, you know, whatever they got, you know, content measure wise, like grade wise, I want that they felt that they grew as a person. And those are just as, I might even say more important an outcome of that classroom as understanding biology. So I want to leave you with three suggestions around this. I guess that's the best way I could phrase this. Number one is to make sure that you're measuring belonging in the same way you would give exams, give quizzes. Ensure there is something in your class that is actually measuring sense of belonging. Provide opportunities for self-reflection. I'll explain what I mean and why in a couple of slides. And consider personal growth timelines. And that is perhaps a little bit more tricky, but we'll see what I mean, right? There are several opportunities to do this, all right? I'm listing a couple of my personal favorites. And, one of them, CCS, stands for Classroom Community Scale. I think the citation is ROVI 2002. Sense of Belonging Instrument, Haggerty and Patuski, 1995. My colleague, Melissa McCartney, I believe, just published one in CBE a couple of years ago. These aren't long, they're not difficult, depending on how your university sets up its evaluations. They can be embedded in the end of course evaluation. Perhaps more simply, it's a Google form. The CCS actually returns an index. So it gives you a pretty robust quantitative measure. It is also validated. In fact, it was initially validated for an online environment. So for those of you who teach that or teach both, do remember that. I would also consider working with your institutional research office. And I know this is a little bit of a slippery slope, not slippery slope per se, but work in progress maybe, because, historically IR departments did a lot of gather data for accreditation stuff and, report to the state's office and things like that. And I've been very pleased to see how many universities have expanded those offices or invested in them to use data in an ethical way to drive inclusive practices, right? And so instead of having to either reinvent the wheel or task already overburdened faculty to now go and do another thing, right? Can you leverage some of the existing resources that the university have to support this kind of work, right? I would even take it a step further, right? I believe that in a university that really truly values teaching, especially R1 institutions, you would have as robust a center of teaching and learning office as you do an office of sponsored research. It wouldn't be the two people who are doing it part-time as 10% of the overall load while they do other stuff. And in that dusty office down the hall in the building, nobody visits. No. If you really value it, you will build the same kind of supportive structure around that practice as you would people's research programs. And these are ways in which you can help support faculty. So A, measure belonging as much as you measure all the other stuff. Number two, provide opportunities for self-reflection. A couple of points on this. Many of you all probably know the literature on wise interventions, which is sort of built around affirmation theory, right? A lot of really interesting papers in psychology. I think there's a couple in science on the idea that when you provide students opportunities to affirm values, that act of affirmation actually creates a growth mindset, agency and things associated with that ends up in great academic outcomes, even health outcomes in some papers that I've seen, right? I, as those of you who've heard me give speeches in my own classroom, use it as a pedagogical tool, not necessarily to study from a wise intervention perspective, but more on, I want to get to know you. I want to know what's in your soul, right? So at the beginning of the semester, I used this, I believe, which is an NPR program. There's guidelines for instructors that you can copy paste because it's very good. And at the end of the semester, I used this one on the left, the Walton and Cohen, where they did it as an experiment, as a manipulation, not as a kind of class thing. But I actually use it as the end of semester reflection. And the prompt is, write a letter to a hypothetical future first-year student. Based on your successes and challenges, how would you advise them to be successful in this class or at this university? And so what that prompt forces them to do is to reflect on their growth during that time period. What did you learn about yourself? And it doesn't have to be like class related, about studying and stuff. It could be what you learned about being a roommate, what you learned about finding friends on campus, what you learned about your own, skills and attitudes and passions. What did you learn about engaging with difference, right? So self-reflection is step 4 in self-regulated learning. And it's important because that is what provides them the opportunity to really sit and analyze and determine if a behavioral change or an attitudinal change is needed, right? Without it, there is a tendency, particularly at this emerging adulthood stage, to, all right, I'll just try harder next time. What does that even mean, right? We're going to put more time, you're going to try a different strategy. No, you give them a chance to actually articulate it. So the thing I want you to, think about with personal growth, and, even though I do believe we need to have more assessments around affect, I think we also sometimes get a little bit, what's the word I'm looking for? Obsessive with everything must get reduced to a number that we can then say this is good or bad. Like personal growth perhaps is not easily assessed. Maybe it's good, especially with these reflections, to observe that it's taking place and give the individual some agency to allow for that growth to happen on their own terms, right? But the reflection allows you to document that, right? I put the IDEA logo because that was the company that provided the student evaluations at my former institution. And I actually liked the structure because it provided a lot of flexibility for each instructor to input questions that were unique to their class, right? So if you have that kind of flexibility in your classroom or your campus, consider having like a one or two reflective questions that gets at some of these constructs. All right. Last but not least, I want you to please consider growth timelines. We have an interesting issue, I think, in science education research, and some of it is a little bit out of control, but I think perhaps we could be a bit more sophisticated in how we address it, right? And that is the fact that we have a higher education system that, for the most part, assumes that a lot of learning takes place in 15 weeks, and everybody takes a break and comes back for another 15 weeks. And then another academic year comes and we, rinse, repeat, and do the whole thing again. And I don't know, we could litigate the whole 15-week thing another time. But the problem with that is when we do studies, or when we think about learning, we think about growth, we think about how people sort of develop identity, we end up being forced to crunch all of our research questions into these artificial timelines. Why? Because that's the length of the course. And so everything ends up looking at the end of semester grade because, well, I don't have any, after they leave, they leave, right? And so your study now then has to assume that 15 weeks is going to bring out all of these great things that you hope it brings out. And if it doesn't, many times people don't have a mechanism, right, to capture that. So just to give you an example, I may have a student who left intro bio with a C, but traveled a much longer and circuitous route to that C than somebody who came in with more resources and more privilege and got an A. But if what you're looking at is the A versus the C, then you're not going to see that, right? That C student may go on and fly in ways that you would never imagine. But if you're not looking to the future, right? If you're not playing for the long game, then it comes down to that semester endpoint marker, right? As did it do well? They got an A. If you didn't do well, they got a C, and that then becomes the sum total of all the impact of the things that you did. So just as an example, I've shown people this slide many times that we do a lot of inclusive pedagogy in intro bio, but we track the students into their sophomore and junior years. And we find that, yes, even though, we close their gaps and all that stuff, but to me, the real proof in the pudding is that those C students went on to the upper division classes, and even though they had 50% less content, they actually outperformed their peers from other classes, right? So when you're thinking about measuring equity, do think about when that impact might happen and when you might want to capture that effect. I'll just close by saying a quick thank you to the group of students who've always taught me what it meant to design a class for equity by listening to their voice, by thinking of their futures and thinking of our futures in which they will be shapers and agents in in politics and in social structures. And I'll stop there and take any questions that you might have.
So thank you, Brian, for your very insightful talk. There is a comment in the chat, and it's wondering whether or not a sense of belonging changes with, these radical, I would call them radical teaching practices that we have now, such as on-grading and competency grading. What do you think?
I think it would. I think it would. But what I would be careful of is assuming that you have to ungrade to increase sense of belonging. This is not me saying that I'm against ungrading. I'm just saying that some of the benefits of those practices can sometimes be realized before those practices are enacted. But to Miriam's point when she presented, this whole idea of getting students to kind of be invested in this growth mindset model of having more agency in the learning process and quite honestly, just being transparent about how they develop those skills. Yes, that gives them ownership of that experience, and I believe will increase sense of belonging. So I know my colleague Katie Martini, from Roger Williams University does a lot of work, and I think she measures that as well. I don't know if Miriam has as well, but yeah, I would definitely say yes.
All right, so we're out of time, unfortunately. So again, thank you for your insight and wonderful work that you're doing. And to all the presenters, I want to again express my gratitude to you for taking the time to share with us your work. I'm sure you could see that there are several common themes amongst you all. One is, helping students to develop a sense of belonging and having a growth mindset, which is really important. And in addition, as instructors, we have a significant role to play as well in helping our students to develop to be the successes that they can be in life. So again, thank you all. Thank you all. And I also would like to express my gratitude to all of you who took the time out to join us on this Friday afternoon. So thanks again for joining us. And again, I want to thank NABT and Jackie RP for all her support for these initiatives. And lastly, I would like to remind you that the session was recorded and it will be available at the NABT website as well as on the YouTube channel at some time down the road by the new year. Again, have a wonderful afternoon. I learned something today. Tomorrow is National Cookie Day, so have a cookie tomorrow. Okay, have a wonderful evening. Take care.